So it's been a real pleasure to be involved in GrAiNZ over the years and see all the same faces coming through, but always every year there's new people, and it's the most gratifying part of being involved is that the message just goes out further and further away from just the bakers and into all the other end users and back to farmers. The only thing we've got this year is not quite so many farmers because of the scheduling of GrAiNZ at sowing time and also just prior to sowing time, so people are out in the fields trying to get their head around what to sow. But you do have some fantastic people who are here, like Burrum and Chirong, who you can talk to about all of this seed preparation and how it's going to be sown. The first slide that I've got up here shows a monocrop on the left, which is probably quite familiar to you. They always look pretty cool when they're really cranking out the car window when you're whizzing past in the wheat belt, tabletop wheat, looking strong. And then on the right is the crazy crowd of Skagit 1109 population wheat, which initially we were lucky enough in South Australia to get 5 kilos given to us by Jason and Emma. Thank you very much. That came through quarantine a couple of years prior to that. Through Jason's efforts, that is a population that was bred over, was it 11 seasons, I think, before it was released. And that was sown for the first time in South Australia in 2019 it was. And from the very start, it was one of our winners. It was one of the highest yielders. It was also the thickest crop. It produced a fantastic amount of bulk matter. And for the farmer that was growing it for us, he was able to do a secondary cut out of all of that bulk matter and produce fantastic straw bales for his cattle. So the main thing about talking about population wheats and reviving older varieties of wheats and rye for that matter is it often comes back to how the farmer approaches their farming system and what they can gain that's not only a grain crop with a particular endpoint price that goes direct to, say, a miller, or even via a bulk silo to a miller and then to an end user. It's also the other ways that that crop can benefit the farming system. That's that magic sound. I'll try that one. Yeah. In 2019, Jason and I attended CEREA, which was the Cereal Diversity Festival at Kalo Agricultural College in west of Copenhagen in Denmark. It was quite a mind-blowing festival for me to be at. It was quite remarkable because of the multi-actor involvement that was encouraged and fostered by EU funding. There was millions of euros spent between 2016 and 2021 on the Cereal Diversity Project in Europe. It also combined universities and institutional researchers with farmers and processors. They were from UK, Ireland, Scotland, Italy, France, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Hungary, Spain, and for the first time in 2019, Australia. Jason had sent over some of his wheat and, did you send rye? Wheat seeds to be grown out in plots. And that was part of the festival, was that there were field walks. Up in the top right there, you can see there are multiples of plots growing out at the Agricultural College, so that we could walk through and have a look at how they were pretty much all of the crops were in heading stage, and we could compare and chat to the breeders and the growers of those different crops about there are the different agronomical approaches, the end use, and the breeding strategies that had been employed by the researchers in the first place. There were quite a few historic varieties that were revived as well that had gone back into the food system in Europe, and Jason was doing a similar thing. It was probably only a small part way through your bulking up program. We just started milling the flour. But yeah, it was quite visually striking to be walking through those fields. But the thing that was blowing my mind when I was at that festival was the number of population crops that had been developed and released back into the food system via participatory farmers across Europe. It celebrated the revival of culturally significant historic cereals at the festival, but also there was a particular emphasis on new approaches to cereal breeding that use the genetic resource of extremely diverse breeds of wheat with diverse genetics that could be mined for the benefit of future crops. The CRAiNZ project over those years was able to produce a number of research topics that were reported on. There were 252 studies made and reported on, and that was mostly in the core areas of alternative and sustainable food systems, health and nutrition, agriculture and food processing connections. Activities that gained momentum as a result of this multi-sector stimulation were seed-saving networks, local food systems, knowledge and learning systems sharing, organic agricultural and certification frameworks and all of the issues that surrounded those kind of frameworks, fair governance, social justice and equal access issues. This is something that you might see is echoed all through GrAiNZ 2023, is the alignment between plant diversity and human diversity, and it's something that you also see in both of our presentations, is that people matter just as much as the plants, because they are the ones that control the every aspect of sowing and using. There was one of the presentations at the CRAiNZ festival was from the Solibam group. That's initiated by an Italian social justice and wheat and legumes. They had barley, durum and wheat, and also peas, particularly that they focused on producing population crops. 3/4 of the funding for that project over a 4-year period from 2010 to 2014 came from the EU, and that was €6 million. There were 12 countries involved in the Solibam project from Europe and North Africa. The North African breeders were, breeding institutions were involved there. They designed and tested strategies to promote biological and social diversity in agricultural systems. The problem was identified that there was a lack of adapted varieties for organic and low input agriculture. Many farms operating with these approaches cover highly variable environments and cultural practices. The planting material available is mostly bred and developed to produce high yields and disease resistance across massive geographical regions, for instance, a wheat belt. The success of these monocultures is ensured by amending the growing environment through seed preparation, through fungicide, pickling, sprays, and also basically being able to centralise the processing of that seed and transport it over great distances with a shelf life attached to both the seed and the refined flour. And this also enables trading on a global scale. Out of this project, Solibam were able to identify 3 cornerstone concepts to inform future ag policies, and it has actually been put in place in several of the European ag policies, including diversity, participatory innovation and locality, which translates to terroir. Heard about that one from the wine industry. It also relates to cereal crops, because We've shown from growing our cereal crops over various regions that seasonal variation, but also the mysterious interactions with the soil and the seed have conferred different terroir characteristics, and when you bake with them, you can really taste it. Solobam utilised evolutionary plant breeding technology, and that involves careful parent selection. That was from the International Centre for Agricultural Research in Dry Areas. You might have heard of ACADA. There were thousands of lines crossed in a single year. There are different approaches to evolutionary plant breeding populations. This one was a single year, and they were grown out over 8 seasons. They produced populations from wheat seed, barley seed and durum seed. And after 8 seasons, the populations were released out into Italy. There was a guarantee of a minimum of 500 grams of seed that was sent out to each farmer from a mother farm. And the mother farm had information available about the common characteristics to expect from the plants and the grains, and also connections to end users so that there could be that kind of feedback shared as well. The 2 wheat populations derived from one, which was called Solobam tenero floridia. That was from the Tuscan region. From there, one of the parcels of wheat was sent down to Sicily, and that gained such an individual set of characteristics. It was called Solobam tenero lirosi, and that had eventually, when it stabilised, virtually all awned wheats, still with a great amount of diversity. It was thought that that would confer drought resistance. There's some evidence that the awns can hold on to just a sort of a more of a nutrition sink for the wheat plants as they're coming into the dry and hot season. There's a little bit of frost resistance available in awns as well. When we could see that in our field walk back on the Agricultural College, the 2 populations which had derived from one only, I think it was 5 or 6 seasons before, looked completely different. So that's all about adaptation in place, and this is what we've been able to do between Chirong Farm and the Skagit 1109, which has now got the name of Garland 1109 because it's gained its own identity in Australia. We've seen that they're kind of the same, but they're starting to become different and get their own identity. So what happens from here is to be seen. Another one of the presentations at the Cereal Diversity Conference was all about Wakeland's population wheat, the YQ. You might have heard of that at the last big GrAiNZ conference in 2019 up at Redbeard Bakery. Kim Bell was the keynote, and she's a strong partner with Martin Wolf, who developed this population wheat. It was a really great story, and it was so new to a lot of ears that it might be worth repeating some of the parts of that story because it was kind of wrapped up in art and romance and people coming together, connections and linking arms and going forward. It was just so great. So anyway, Martin Wolf, the instigator and the guy that closed off on this and released this population, he had just died when Kimberley attended GrAiNZ in 2019. He has an interesting beginning in this whole area. Part of his life, a good part of his life, was spent, he was helping develop on a mass scale, East German growers of spring malting barley to use mixtures in their fields. This was to mitigate versus powdery mildew, which is actually a problem in Australia as well. It's one of the fungicide treatments that farmers will spray out is against powdery mildew. It does affect yield and quality. This was so successful in East Germany that it was more than 50% of the spring malting barleys were these mixtures by the end of the 1980s in East Germany. What they were trying to do was not buy the expensive West German fungicides, so they were strongly motivated to really follow through on this project. They managed to reduce the national incidence of powdery mildew to just under 10%, but they were still able to sell all of their malting barley on quality parameters. That was down to selection of quality parents and also persistence by all stakeholders in getting that project forward. It ended up falling over with the unification of Germany. The funding completely stopped, and so monocultures became the norm. Martin Wolf kept on going though, and he developed the YQ. He was responding to the ongoing challenges that farmers face all around the world with boom and bust cycle. So a static cultivar, which is the norm, it's something that's released every couple of years. There'll be a big release celebrated by a private seed company, a new cultivar with quality and yield and disease resistance advantages. There's a royalty paid on that seed by the farmers when they buy it, and that contributes back into R&D at the GRDC, and they're able to continue on with really valuable research into high quality cultivars. The problem is that Martin Wolf could see was that these cultivars had static characteristics. They really relied on the environment being adjusted and amended by farmers to be successful, rather than the plant being an adaptive character in the growing system that could respond to environmental changes, which are becoming more and more frequent. So he ended up producing the YQ out of 20 parents that were crossed 190 times. He kept that going over 11 years, and he released the Wakelands population as a seed source that had to be open resource. It's traded, the seed source, through farms around the UK. But what's happened is some of the end users have been involved with farmers and breeders to select out some of the less desirable lines that are in this crazy population, and try to make it more of a, say, a milling blend, maybe something that has more resilience in a particular region in the UK. So a population is dynamic. It's able to be changed and spiked and moved around. It will adapt anyway when it's in place. I actually asked Kimberly Bell the other day how much she thought that was being used in bakeries and how much it was being grown in the UK currently. The last time I spoke to her about it was in 2021. And she got back to me and she said, unfortunately, the data about where that population has ended up has been lost because due to lack of funding and just exhaustion, the data isn't collected. And so she's trying to get some groups together through the UK Grain Lab to try to get a handle on where it is and who's using it and how much. She really doesn't think there's more than 10 bakers that are using it in the UK, but it's being used by far more farmers because they really like what it does for their paddocks and in their rotations. She said that's a good thing. And the other thing is she had an anecdote to tell where she was catering at a function, at a conference, wasn't under her name, she was helping out, and a woman was picking up her plates of food, and Kim was handing out the bread that she'd made for the function and offered it to a woman who was fairly abrupt and said, oh no, I don't eat bread unless it's YQ. And Kimberly said, you're in luck. I'm one of 10 bakers in the UK who's using it, and here you go. She said it was pretty thrilling to know that people were identifying it as something that they really wanted. So at Small World Bakery, where I'm from in South Australia originally, around about the same time that Jason and Emma at Toorong were making requests to the Australian GrAiNZ Gene Bank, and Jason was going a step further and making his own importations of various cereal lines from overseas. We were doing the same thing, making requests to the Australian GrAiNZ Gene Bank at Horsham. That's just a pick of that was the first request that I made. I really went down a list of what other bakers overseas were using, thinking that they would be functional in the bakery, and then I looked back at who was growing them and in what regions, and I just tried to put it together, really not having much idea of how it was going to go in South Australia and whether I'd be able to bake with it, but it was worth getting it going. It was a case of just suck it and see, but get something in and growing. The Australian GrAiNZ Gene Bank exists to preserve diversity for future resourcing. It's like a library, and it is pretty much a static resource. They keep most of their lines of seed in cold rooms, and there's a limited amount of information available for each of the lines if you are to try to make any kind of request. You have to really do a bit of work as really you've got to go and look at other gene banks and other resources overseas to get more information about the lines. Nomenclature is a massive problem for all of these gene banks. So many of the seeds have been collected off roadsides or been donated and collected from farmers who've made their own selections and put their own name on it for whatever reason. So a lot of their cross-referencing has to do with growing the seed out and having a really good look at how the plant grows and what the head looks like, and maybe doing some testing on the grain. So that's what we think we got, and we grew them out, and because we were mollycoddling them in a really beautiful little plot, everything went super well. So, yep, hand watering, putting compost on every row. You just don't do that when you're out in the paddock. We harvested using small-scale machinery. We had to modify gardening equipment. It was something that was pretty fun to try to nut out, but all the time we were thinking, how are we going to do this when it gets to paddock scale? Because these things can really yield, not like a tabletop monocrop wheat, but yield in our context. We were bakers. We were all the time, it was all towards building a local grain economy, which is the most fun part of doing this kind of thing. What you're doing is you're connecting to your end users and your customers and talking about why you're doing what you're doing, and you're getting a bit of a feel of whether you're on the right track. You're starting from the field and going all the way through to the bakery and producing something really delicious. The season 2018 was a bit of a stopper. It was a reality check. That was an ironic photo shoot with a local paper. He wanted to get us carrying a basket of bread in a field of what turned out to be almost nothing. What I learnt from that season, it was a drought year, really cold winds. It was very difficult for the wheat to produce much more than just replacement, and it made me really, in 2018, that was what really turned me on to the possibility of populations, because the monocrops that we were growing were just surviving, and what we harvested, of course, was going to have its own resilience because it had survived. But what if there could be a population? There'd be much more diversity to offer. This is what we ended up with last year. On the left is a monocrop of Arapaho wheat, which is a modern red wheat from 1988 in Nebraska. And on the right is our own landrace, and that's a combination of old Australian wheats that were also combined with a more modern owned wheat, just to give it a little bit of diversity of height. The thing about populations is when there is diversity, you get plant architecture diversity, and therefore you get more opportunities for sunlight to penetrate beyond the canopy, down further into the plants. You get better yields because of that. You also get root zones at slightly different levels, perhaps. You get longer root length, and you get access to possibly more nutrients. And of course, from a baker's point of view and an eater's point of view, that means yummier breads. I'm going to zip through a little bit here. That's the Skagit. Oh, that just shows you the beautiful variance in heads and heights. I just love that. I just love looking at those photos. I was gazing at them. But yeah, just the different colours. And what happens when you're harvesting a population weed is they self-select out for season length and height. So if you can't harvest it, it's not going to make it through into the next year. Slortblandsdinger. Is anybody Danish? Because I don't know if I've pronounced that anything near what it's supposed to be. These are mixed cultivar trials that have become reality in Denmark. I heard about this on Twitter. In season 21-22, 20% of the Danish wheat area was sown to mixed cultivars. And that was to confer resistance to Septoria Trichi blotch, and that's a fungal infection that is caused by splash. It's everywhere. We had it particularly over in South Australia. What they found is by mixing cultivars in a single field is the plants not only had greater resistance to that fungal infection, but there was less fungicide resistance. They were able to measure the gene mutation that occurs that selects for fungicide resistance, by the pathogen. Because they were just an unpredictable plant and the pathogen couldn't recognise that it was something that had a resistance built in, anthropomorphising slightly, but it helps to understand. So this has been so successful that it's become the norm for a lot of farmers in Denmark. In the meantime, Australians were responding. They were making studies as well. Jason's already mentioned one of them. There's been problems in funding and persistence in funding on the Australian side with cultivar mixtures. There are single and 3-year studies that are made, and overall there are yield benefits. There's yield stability from having mixtures in one field, and there is some degree of fungal attack resistance. But I think because there isn't persistence, because farmers are really relying on extra support and funding from institutions, and those institutions have moved on to the next thing, and really they're quite turned on by the pure lines that are released every year. We're a little bit stuck in Australia. In the meantime, anecdotally, if you ask farmers, they don't want to declare it, but a lot of them are mixing cultivars and delivering into the bulk silos. They risk, when they declare that, being downgraded at the silo because there's an aversion to anything different, particularly in a bulk scenario and when there's global trading involved. But yeah, it really does help with different flowering periods for 2, 3, 4 cultivars. You'll still get a crop if there's frost at flowering. You are still able to get, if one of them's potentially going to be affected at grain fill stage by heat stress, there'll be possibly another one in that population or mixture that isn't. You'll just get a crop at the end. Terminal drought at the end, some of them are able to continue photosynthesising closer to senescence and harvest than others shut down sooner. So these are all the things that populations are able to offer. And this is the final slide. So on the way to GrAiNZ in 2019, we took Steve Jones into the stick shed at Matoa. This is just the most wonderful place that I really recommend everybody try to get to. What it is, it's a meeting of the history of Australian wheat from Second World War, where temporary sheds were built to house wheat that couldn't be traded overseas because of the war and the risks that were associated with shipping. They're 22-metre high mountain ash sticks. It's a flexible roof structure, it sways, there are pigeons, it sounds magical, it echoes, and now I think it's the Lions or the Rotary Club run tours through there, but it's really a space for poetry and art and puppetry exhibitions. And once again, it's just the meeting of the potential beauty of wheat and all of the things that make wheat part of us and part of our culture, and helping us to appreciate the history of our wheat production in Australia. And there's Steve Jones, he's his own kind of stick. walking through, gazing up and thinking, what the fuck is this place? Yeah, I really recommend going to the stick shed at Matoa. Thank you very much.